All right, thank you all for coming to tonight's public hearing. We will have a presentation from our Director of Finance, Anthony Francisco, and I think we're pulling him from another meeting to come in here. Tonight, we're going to have it after his presentation, take comments, and I think that's all we have on the agenda. I encourage you all to stick around at 6:30. No, this is when this will, at 7. It will be the League of Women Voters Candidate Forum for the races of wards 2, 4, and 6. So, is he on his way? Excellent. And this is being televised. The YouTube channel, and so is the League of Women Voters. Good.
Squeezing every moment of production out of these guys. Yeah, here he comes.
Yeah, I've already called you up, sir. You
Good
should have known I was
afternoon,
going to start
Madam.
this right at 4:30.
All right.
Thank you so much for being here. And now we'll have a presentation on the proposed budget cuts from our Director of Finance, Anthony Francisco.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I'm Anthony Francisco, the Finance Director. I was asked to make just some brief remarks on what got us to this point. The council received its annual mid-year budget review a week ago Thursday, and at that mid-year budget review, information was presented about where we closed last fiscal year, which is the start of this fiscal year. We were concentrating on the general fund, although the mid-year review covers pretty much all the funds of the city. The discussion concentrated on the general fund. We talked about the fact that the general fund started this fiscal year with the fund balance about $2 million more than what we projected when the budget was adopted. We talked about the fact that a lot of that fund balance was anticipated and projected to be drawn down during this fiscal year because of the city's acquisition of the public transit system from the University of Oklahoma. So we thought that we would end this fiscal year with the fund balance at a fairly low level, about, make sure I'm giving a correct number here. With the fund balance ending this fiscal year of about $3.7 million. And that was when we adopted the budget. We then, as the fiscal year progressed and we updated those projections both for revenues and expenditures, pretty much our revenues have shown to be right on budget so far this fiscal year. Our expenditures have been somewhat below budget, primarily because we have not had to spend down our budgeted emergency reserve fund in the general fund. So we thought that we would end this fiscal year with the fund balance of about $3.7 million. As you know, that budget was based on an assumption that we would stop apportioning sales tax from the general fund to the University of North Park TIF fund as of July 1st of this fiscal year. And council took action to make that projection come to fruition when it adopted an ordinance in November of 2019 that amended the University of North Park TIF project plan to reduce the amount of authorized projects to the amount that we already had on hand in the escrow agent bank. So we could stop apportioning sales tax retroactively to July the 1st. That council action, however, was held in abeyance because of petition against the city. And because that petition was certified to have the number of required signatures to hold in abeyance the council's ordinance, we have had to continue to apportion sales tax. We're apportioning sales tax from the general fund and the capital fund to the University of North Park TIF fund at about $300,000 per month, which means that all other things being equal, we think that we will end this fiscal year with a fund balance of only about $700,000. And on an $80 million budget, that is an unacceptably low level, as we discussed it with the Finance Committee. And then going forward into next fiscal year, if all of those projections hold true, we would not be able to adopt the budget because with that low carryover fund balance and the projected shortfalls that we would be projecting next fiscal year, because the sales tax apportionment would continue into next fiscal year, we could not adopt a budget legally under the State Budget Act. So the council started to take some discussion about what we might do to cut some costs to rectify that situation first in this fiscal year and in the coming budget year. I presented to council some areas of potential reductions, and these are just that. These are some areas that I proposed to the Council Finance Committee, just based on some areas where we hope to have some savings in individual line item accounts that are large this fiscal year, and some individual program areas that are outside of the general purposes of the general fund budget, the nuts and bolts, if you will, the field services that we provide to our citizens. The council had given a direction when we discussed this previously in November of areas to cut costs, and gave a parameter that they did not want to see, at least in this fiscal year, any proposed cuts that would cause furloughs or layoffs of existing employees. So we took that as a parameter and came up with these areas that are listed here. I won't try to read them, but I'll just highlight a couple of them. First, we're making an assumption that we will not have to spend our 1% emergency reserve in this fiscal year, assuming we don't have any tornadoes or floods or anything like that that would cause us to hire the outside contractors that council will consider on your agenda tomorrow. If we don't have to use those outside contractors and expend that $786,000, that would be a savings to our fund balance in this fiscal year. We discussed with council the ability to draw down our rainy day fund balance. There are restrictions on the council's ability to draw down the rainy day fund balance. There has to be a federally declared disaster in Cleveland County and in Norman, or the general fund has to be drawn down below its 1% required fund balance level after the expenditure of the 1% emergency reserve. And because of the actions that have been placed before the city with the inaction of the council's ordinance, we would be below that 1%. So council could draw down its fund balance in the rainy day fund. But if you draw down rainy day fund balance below its minimum level, you have to replenish the rainy day fund within 3 fiscal years of when you drew it down. So what we discussed with the Finance Committee was that we would not recommend drawing the rainy day fund balance below its minimum level. So the figure that you see there is the amount that we could draw without drawing the rainy day fund below its projected minimum level. In future years, you see that we have some areas of discussion of basically programs that we would just not do in the future. We would stop doing the mosquito control program. We would stop providing fireworks at the Norman Day Festival on July the 4th. We would stop funding the outside agencies such as the Firehouse Arts Center and the Sooner Theater. We would stop funding the Social and Voluntary Services Commission agencies that we do on an annual basis. So those are just my first cut. a start to addressing the $5 million gap that we had in the budget. And at that meeting, the council wanted to have this public hearing for more open discussion with the council and with the public on how we might address this shortfall that has been forced upon us. Any questions for me?
Okay, Councilmember Wilson?
My question is probably for Catherine Walker. Is it possible for us to make a minor amendment on the currently in effect project plans in the UNP TIF area?
No, there's case law out there that says pretty clearly that you cannot make amendments to legislation that is the subject of a referendum. And here in this case, it would be the TIF ordinance, because that could impact or render moot the referendum petition, which is once it's certified and proceeding, it's a constitutional right, and we aren't.
Can the current, if that were withdrawn, and I don't know that it could be or not, but could it be, first of all, and second of all, if it were, could we then be legally do that?
I don't believe it could be withdrawn. I've looked for some case law on this subject. I think once it's certified and turned in and all of that business, it cannot be withdrawn, because now it's been signed by, so many citizens
Right.
asking for this election.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Seeing no other questions, and given this is an opportunity for a public hearing, we will now begin taking public comment. And remember, when you come to the microphone, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
My name is Steve Ellis, 633 Reed Avenue. I'm in Ward 4. I'm also the person who is the proponent of the petition we were just talking about, and I want to take issue with some of the claims that the city attorney just made. I think it's important that we actually look at the law, which is why I sent a memo to everyone here today about the relevant case law. The case that the city attorney was relying on, which was In Re Initiative Petition Number 1, Sand Springs, or In Re Referendum Petition Number 1, Sand Springs from 1950, the main claim being made in that case was that the city council couldn't do what they did, which was explicitly repeal an item that had been referred to referendum via the referendum and initiative petition. So they explicitly repealed something. That's a little different from what's going on here. And if you actually read further into what the case says, every case where it's clear, they talk about the city council can't touch the particular piece of legislation that has been referred to the people. That's either directly or indirectly, I will admit that. And the very semi-quote that the city attorney was using in her memo to you on January 10th, I think is pretty clearly a misunderstanding of what was going on. If you actually look at the grammar, it's saying what I'm saying and not what she was saying. I think it's also to note, important to note, then in Oklahoma Tax Commission versus Smith, which is a 1980 case, which handles precisely this kind of issue, and it's really determined based on In Re Initiative Petition Number 1. The court looked in particular at an initiative petition that proposed a cap on taxes, income tax in the state of Oklahoma, and the Supreme Court of Oklahoma made it very clear that that did not prevent the legislature from passing laws involving tax rates, which is a direct repudiation of the city attorney's understanding of this particular case. As a matter of fact, when you look at the end of that case, which is in the footnote of the memo that I talked to you about, what the Supreme Court said was the legislature retains its power to pass stuff unless it has been specifically excluded. The specific exclusion applies to the thing that's up for a vote on the referendum, which would be the 2019 project plan in this case. And therefore, you have a bunch of reserved authority. I mean, I find it a little bit weird that the city attorney is giving you a recommendation that sort of basically restricts your authority from doing things, and in particular, restricts your authority from doing something that would be relatively easy to save the budget. So I hope everyone here will continue to look at the relevant legal issues, look at the cases yourself. The law is not supposed to be one of those things that's completely opaque to citizens, but also ask your attorney friends. I understand that there are advantages to listening to the city attorney, but there are also reasons why the city attorney may not be reading the case right, and I think you've got some of them in front of you. So that should at least be a reason to engage in further discussion and not to roll this out right now. Thank you.
Next.
Paul Arcaroli, 405 Garland Court. So what I didn't see on this list, and I'm curious if we can bring this into the discussion, would be we have a beautiful municipal golf course, and I know I probably risk the ire of hundreds of golfers everywhere when I bring this in. The possibility of putting that on the chopping block, either not subsidizing or possibly selling or possibly privatizing that particular large piece of real estate, especially, I mean, as relates to this budget crisis, but also the fact that we have all these wonderful, wonderful parks that are not golf courses that are in disrepair also and could use a little extra boost. And I do believe that the golf course is being subsidized, so it'd be worth the discussion introduced to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Evan A. Dunn, 1400 Garfield Avenue, Ward 7. This is about the budget, right? Just generally about the budget?
The proposed budget cuts.
Okay. Oh, wow. I loved what Paul had to say. Can a golf course not go from 18 to 9 or 9 to 4 and you still get the experience? Why every golfer, this is too much, but doesn't use bilateral training in the performance and experience of the sport is missing the power of sports. I'll take a pay cut. I'll take a pay cut. I'll do it. Gosh, I missed what Steve had to say. Is there anything missing that I should be talking about? Well, that's what I'm saying. What about the budget? Reduce police, fire, supervision, freeze. Oh.
Thank you.
Hello, Jason Zimmer, 3809 Cedarbrook. A few items I wanted to bring up regarding the budget, questions. We've got the PSST component, and I'm wondering if that's something that we can delay or slow down the implementation of. The open positions that were at the Finance Committee meeting that were discussed, are those funded in the budget? So that's another area. And then what accounts for the significant increase in the staffing and budgets for the Irving, Whittier, and 12th Avenue Rec Center budgets? So those are ones that I were thinking about. And then also too, the NEDC funding, the city portion of the NEDC funding. How much do we pay towards that? And is that up for discussion? Thank you.
Thank you.
Ian Moore, 811 Mockingbird. As we look at this, the number one item up there is assume a 1% emergency savings. We're in this position because people assumed a $3.5 million change within the TIF construct. Assumptions with budgets are bad. Have the money in hand and spend the money in hand, or at least a known entity, and don't assume something's going to happen with money until it actually doesn't happen. Because I guarantee if you make your plan based on this 1% emergency savings, we will use this 1% emergency savings. It's going to happen. Part two, I've heard the golf course closing, and while I don't want to specifically talk to that, I would be very careful as to what we assume a developer will and can do associated with that golf course. It's in the clear zone for the airport, and there are limitations to what can happen. Now, I'm not an expert on clear zones and airport clear zones, but part of the reason the arena wasn't occurred is by fighting from the airport manager, who said that, and this is just in part, who was concerned that putting that arena that close to the airport was going to create a possibility for a catastrophic happening at that arena. So there will be limitations to what can actually be developed within the scope of that golf course area. And the other question I have, and this is just out of ignorance, so I'll claim that, we're looking at moving a lot of staffing over into the old library building. Is that correct? Where is all this staffing coming from? Is it just a natural growth model associated with the city? But why has the staff gotten that big where we need to move them to a much larger space? Is there it's a question that doesn't have to only be asked here. It has to be asked of state agencies and national agencies. But I would start to look at where the staffing efficiencies may occur.
Thank you.
Roger Gallagher, 2513 Woodsong. I haven't, like a lot of other people, taken the time to look in great detail to some of these things, but I'd like to suggest a couple of points. You're probably following along pretty much on a similar path. But cutting people, it seems to me, is the last thing that any city should do. You know, in the last time when we had this go-around of partial furloughs, it, I think, flew in the face of cutting some programs that would not cut people's jobs, but eliminate some expenses. The idea of public safety being brought up, I think, is one of the core functions of any city. And to do that, there would be effects on society, I think, that would not be very well received. I think that should be one of the foremost pillars that you have, as well as public services for the citizens of the city. The golf course idea with the airport is true. The clear space that the greens immediately available on takeoff to the south offer a person who has an engine failure or a problem. It has established that the golf course is there, and that was one of the main ideas for positioning the golf course the way it is. The idea of, because people crash just about everywhere, especially in bad weather and if you have mechanical problems, and yesterday's problem is a clear example. With marginal weather, a building that is that close to the airport does pose some safety problems, simply because the history of Westheimer and people coming down and landing early is clear. There have been several. to look at something as comprehensive as this, I thought about something that we tried back when I was on city council. We got a red light on the whole idea, but it happened with the sheriff's department prior to the city taking consideration of it. And that was the use of people who are doing time, generally people who are serving short sentences and they want something to do and they're not hardened criminals, is to use them for community services. The airport had this arranged with the city, with the county, approximately 20 years ago. They came in, they did janitorial work, they did work around the terminal building and the parking, and it was fairly successful. To my knowledge, there were no real dust-ups there. I think with some of these infrastructure situations, such as mowing and things such as that, general pickup, some maintenance, light maintenance, I think that could be brought again and put before the chief of police, the sheriff. I think Sheriff Gibson would look favorably at this. And it's worth a try, at least. It emanated from people on the council, and Judge Porch and a couple of other people, particularly the chief of police at the time, considered it, but they decided not to do it. Now it's not a difficult thing to set up, but that might be one small finger in the dike if there are expenses that are bleeding the budget and there's a way to trim it. I don't see here jobs, people actually being furloughed. That should be a principle, a golden principle, that we don't get rid of people, we make adjustments. And that's, I think, one of the sterling things of some of these ideas. Look at public safety and do not think that that's a fat pie. That is not. It's lean. It could have been more, but that's how council passed it, with that percentage and that money. So I would say be careful with that. The quality of life depends on people who stand before us when there are problems we can't solve. So that's some of my ideas, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Robert Husky, 3615 Chatham Court, Ward 3. Actually, I'm curious, how did the UNP actually come to be? It's got an airport next to it. That would be a great place for crashes to occur. I mean, I really can't understand why it's there. OU Foundation. Now, the main thing what I wanted to say here was freezing summer park maintenance temps. Okay. I was one of those. I actually was given the task of taking care of the rose gardens that surrounded the train depot. They don't exist now. It wasn't my fault. I did a really good job of taking care of those rose gardens, and that led actually to me being employed by a local tree surgeon who was looking over my shoulder as I was doing this work, and he said, "You did a good job, I'm going to employ you." Well, I then had that job while I was in college. I worked half-time for this tree surgeon, and because I learned a lot about trees, when I had to take a life science course at OU, which was required back then because the president was a botanist, I took a course in botany. And darn, that was really neat. And that led to my whole career in biological sciences. So you see, if you cut that, you may be cutting off the future earnings, large earnings maybe, of some kid who'll take a job for maybe 10 hours a week. Just thought you'd know.
Thank you.
Just one more time. Paul Arcaroli, 405 Garland Court. A couple of things. Yeah, we could be creative about the golf course, by the way. I'm not saying shut it down, close it out. We could actually swap. The golf course can become a park, and then other outlying parks can be developed, possibly, or half the size, or privatize, but keep the land, of course, available and open. So, yeah, I just think we should continue to think creatively about the resources that are there. But I did have an initial thought as about our hotel motel tax. It seems like that hasn't changed since about 1984, and I think right now we're allocating about $1 million to the Visitor Bureau. Maybe reallocation of some of that, maybe changing the tax, maybe increasing the tax. Those are some things like that would be really, really kind of neat, sort of kind of low-lying fruit sorts of things. And I haven't really heard anything about the hospital land purchase. I heard some rumors about, well, holding seniors in hostage for land and value and all that. So that'd be interesting to talk about also. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rob Norman, 4604 Greystone Court, Ward 3. I'd like to talk exclusively about that $300,000 line item for eliminate GF agency funding up there. I'm thinking of 4 agencies who are on that list right now and don't want to leave any out, but I can keep track of 4. Bethesda, kids. Food and Shelter for Friends, homeless. Women's Resource Center, battered women and their kids. One more in there, I believe, is also kids. So I remembered 3. But the point is $300,000 kind of looks like a big line item and you're going to save a lot. But what's it going to do to those agencies? Let's remember, by definition, they're nonprofits. They're not in it to maximize profits, by definition. They're a break-even proposition. And when you take some money out of their budget, you remove them from in the black to in the red. And they suffer, and sometimes they die. And then all those services they provide that the city can't provide by itself, but maybe can fund on a smaller level, withers, and maybe it dies. Maybe not forever, but maybe for a long time. And that makes a lot of difference in the lives of kids, in the lives of the homeless, in the lives of battered women, and sometimes it saves those lives. So let's find another solution than taking that $300,000 out of the city's funding to nonprofits who need the money to sometimes survive. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
Bill Wilson, 4650 Hiding Lake Drive, Ward 1. I guess I'll start on NRH. As many of you know, for about 3 months I've been asked to purchase the land to the south side of the hospital, which is not part of the lease. It is owned by the city, been used for parking for decades, free of cost. I've sent it in, still don't have an answer what the city will sell it for. In that regard also, there's 40 parcels of land owned by the city. Some of it can't be sold. There's millions of dollars that can be sold. Some of it you want to look at reserved for later use. I recommend getting the with the county and get a list of each one of them by address, get the acreage, what it's used for, and look what can be sold or not. You've got acreage, for instance, on the Robinson, on the underpass where you put the train. You took 3 houses down, and that can be redone and sold pretty easy. There's plenty of land out there, put a store or whatever right there, just that one spot. And the last thing I got is I've heard it. I don't know what the truth. I've asked Anthony, still haven't heard it. He said he had to talk to the police department. But, on the Facebook, who knows what's right and wrong? It says $1.8 million in overtime for the police department. Well, I think we should have a record exactly what it's for and where it's used for events that is really benefiting the business people in that area. I think the fee for that event should be up to cover the cost of that overtime and eliminate out the city budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Cynthia Rogers. Sorry, my voice is a little fuzzy here. 633 Reed Avenue. So we're looking at budget cuts. I see that. Are we looking at revenue, other sources of revenue? Might be a great time to think about our new connection fees that are only 30% of collecting 30%. I know that goes into capital funds, but you can always use extra revenue for projects, so you don't have to use general funds for such things. I know we own some land that OU uses in the airport that we get $0 for. Can we ask them to contribute some money for use of our land? I don't think we get any help with our fire department that serves campus. Can we get some money for that? So I would encourage you to think about other sources of revenue. Also, I know our department is always crying, and my department chair is always saying, save money on paper. And we don't have color copies of things. And I go to all these meetings, and there's pages and pages and pages of color copies of slide presentations. And I think if we're cutting budgets like these social service programs, maybe we could be skimpier and a little more conservative about whatever the color copy budget is here at the city. But I bet it's a pretty big thing, and that would, if we're gonna cut other people's money, we should maybe start with some of our meetings. Thank you.
Any other public comments?
Couple of items I forgot to mention again, Jason Zimmer, 3809 Cedar Brook. One was on the audit process for our city funds. I know there is a regular process by which we look at the funds and how they're spent, but maybe a deeper forensic audit on those items is a possibility. And then 2, we had some recent changes, obviously with CART. OU handed that to us rather unexpectedly, and I know somewhere in the planning for CART and the transition over, there's a change up on the graphics for the buses, paint, whatever else that might be involved. So having worked part-time at a body shop when I was younger, I know that's very expensive. So I don't know if it's $50,000 or, $500,000, but that's a lot of money that goes towards repainting buses. I don't know where that is in the budget, but another item we could look at.
Thank you.
Ann Gallagher, 2513 Wood Song. A number of things. I noticed in the paper a mention of the buses and that they are in shabby condition. OU didn't transition. They dumped it on us in a very poor situation. And I think if we use the buses as advertisement to get some revenue, throw some ads on those buses, get some money coming in rather than going out. We've talked about public safety. I am a huge advocate for public safety. I don't think we can cut anything there. I know that overtime is an issue. I know it's being worked on, but when we have citywide events that are not city-sponsored events, then those agencies that are having those events need to pay for the services that our police department provides. That is one way that you're going to be able to cut some overtime expenses. And it's tough. It's really hard to do that. I understand that. The social agencies, we've cut them in the past, and we've been fortunate enough to, a couple months later, turn around and put that money back in. That's always a hope, but it's only a hope. I think we need to be careful on which social agencies we're cutting. As the gentleman said, when you have services in mental health, services to children, services to the homeless, those are really hard to cut. Somebody's feelings are going to be hurt. But Norman is a community that has stepped up many instances to help counteract some of the funding cuts. That's not a guarantee. That's the problem with it. It's not a guarantee. So it's a tough job. Good luck.
Thank you.
Paul Arcaroli, 405 Garland Court. It just, all these good questions raise other questions, and I just wanted to throw this out. Two things. I don't even know the full status of actually the airport. I believe it's wholly owned by the university, but maybe somebody can correct that. If it is, maybe there's a conversation to be had about that free land, that land strip that we make available for near catastrophes, and maybe there's some kind of reasonable combinations that could be made financially or otherwise. So it's a conversation that we at least should have. The other thing is, Mr. Norman made very, very interesting and poignant comments about social services, and I think it's absolutely essential that we do pay attention to that. What I would say and add to that is we should just ask the question. I don't know what percentage of these budgets that we contribute to these agencies. It could be 50%, it could be 10%, it could be 5%, it could be 2%. We should at least ask the question and explore things creatively. Nobody is saying here that any of these outlays are less important than another, but it's certainly at these times, it's worth at least asking the questions and saying, okay, is it 2%, 1%? What's going on here? And then, if we have to stop, the community does often step up and make those contributions. I know many, many in this room have done that before and will continue to do that. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm Mary Francis, 850C, Cardinal Creek Condos, and I'm curious how many on the council have considered taking another look at the Raftellus study of 2016, which was actually only about water. We really need a study about a lot of the other fees that the city levies. But that was quite an eye-opener about the shortchanging of the city compared to the actual cost. And so I'm hoping that you'll take a look at that. There could be some money to be found there that would put a plug in the budget. Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert Calisbury, 4701 Windrush, Ward 3. Past chair of the Finance Committee for the past 2 years. Pretty familiar with the budget. A couple questions, just to answer some of the questions on there. You guys do get reports from the social services agencies. You get their financial reports, so you do know what percent of their budget they are, so that information is available to you and can easily be found. Regarding raising connection fees, we already have the highest connection fees around. That money goes into the water fund. This is a general fund issue. So I know you're looking at all your fees, that's fine. But I think when you look at that, you also want to make sure that you look at what is the total fee? Are we talking about just what you pay up front? Or are you paying for the ongoing fee? There's two components to this. There's one, the connection fees, and there's the ongoing, you have a new customer that pays every single month. You'll notice that the water fund and the sewer fund are profitable, which means you're overcharging your customers for what product you're providing to them. That is intentional. That is intentional because that overcharging is part of going towards future capital improvements. So that's part of your revenue stream for capital improvements along with the connection fees. So you can't just look at one side of the equation when you do that. And you also have to keep in mind what you have is a revenue problem. Raising connection fees creates revenue for the water fund, excise fund, but does it help you generate business, which generates revenue? Are you going to get more customers? This is a very simple, if you raise your price, do you get more customers? Or if you lower your price, do you get more customers? What is that elasticity of building? I think if you look at your permits in your planning commission, we're not really just knocking it out of the ball as far as people that want to be here already, much less raising the price of admission to come to our great community. I am adamantly against closing the golf course. This is not a personal deal. I belong to OU. I don't play at Westwood, so this is not taking away my golf. But my kids played there. My father played there. And I do play there every once in a while because it's a nice municipal course. You have youth golf and you have senior golf. This is a quality of life issue to have a municipal, affordable golf course. Municipal golf courses don't make money. But you're only talking about losing about $100 grand a year. And prior to that, it was like 80 and 60. It just recently has become something that's not that profitable. And I'll dare say it, you'll lose more money on the senior center than you do on the golf course. If you're going to take the senior center off the table, and I assume you are, then you probably ought to take something that loses less off the table too. If you implemented all these cuts right here, this is 2.1 million. Mr. Francisco, are we 3.5 million short? So you've got to come up with another $1.4 million. If you do all of these cuts, which will hurt tremendously, any of these cuts hurt. But if you did all of these, you're still $1.4 million short. Now this is a short-term problem. Mr. Francisco, if the money from the TIF was coming in, would we have this problem? And if we keep our budgets about the same in future years, we ought to be, it'll be more manageable. Worst case scenario, the TIF is done next February, March. So this is a 1 year, year and a half problem depending on when you start to issue. So you have a short-term cash flow issue. You don't necessarily have and people will argue with this, and I can argue both ways, that you don't necessarily have a systemic budget problem. You do, but this will help quite a bit. And we know if we had a stormwater utility, that $3 million coming in here would solve it too. And I know you've got to wait some time to come bring this back up, but past couple of years, every candidate forum, every council member, number one priority was stormwater. You're going to have to go back and look at that issue. It would have been nice if, when we did the stormwater utility master plan back in 2008, 2009, $5 a month, just like you do the excise tax. A little bit of nose under the table would have got there. But now we're at the point where it's a bigger problem, we've got to look at it. So I think you have to re-look at that. Mr. Francisco also talked about, and this was something we talked about in finance 3 or 4 years ago, the allocation to the capital fund. That is by statute. It's 0.7 cent, Brent? I won't use Anthony's term to make him of a cent. That's $10 million a year. If you cut that to 0.5, 0.4, I don't know, that's what you have to look at discussion, how much that is. That hurts your capital fund, granted. But we do, for the most part, pay as you go on our capital fund. We may have to look at our philosophy of paying for capital projects through debt financing, like most people do. You have a capital project, you have an asset that lasts 10 to 20 years. That is something that you finance over 10 to 20 years. Yes, it's cheaper to pay cash up front when interest rates are high. When interest rates are low, we have bonding capacity. You use that revenue stream from the capital fund. You've got revenue bonds. That's a way to look at it. So I think that's something we want to look at also. Regarding the hotel motel tax, we just raised that 3 or 4 years ago. So this, I don't know, 1980 where somebody said that. It was 3 or 4 years ago, and we are equal to or higher than anybody in the metro. We didn't want to go higher than that. Like Roger, you were on council when we did that, so we went 1%. So I know it's been within the past 5 years. Last year, the council made a wise decision by dropping the emergency savings to 1% from 2%. Otherwise, you'd have another $800,000 issue here. These are tough cuts, but you're going to have to figure out, even if you do all this stuff, where's the other $1.5 million come from? And where does this go next year? February 24th, we're going to have the hearing. Judge is going to tell us one way or another whether the petition goes or does go forward. If the petition is thrown out and it's not appealed, your budget problem is solved because you're going to get the money. I'm assuming it will probably be appealed one way or another. Hopefully it won't be. Both sides knowing the budget problem it creates. So I think these are good discussions. I think they're a little premature. I think you're 24, 30 days ahead of when you have discussions. But I think you need to have these kind of long term. So hopefully when we look at those things, we consider, do you really want to cut mosquito control? You want to risk the West Nile virus? Do you really want to cut fireworks? I mean, we talk about quality of life. These are tough decisions. And council made a tough decision last year when we did the budget. In fact, I specifically remember Councilmember Bierman and I and Hickman asking everybody on council, what are we going to do about the TIF? Are we going to end the TIF and start the appointment July 1st? It was unanimous that that's what we're going to do. And when you have unanimous consent that you're going to do something, it is not irresponsible to budget on money you don't have. So that claim kind of bothered me. If we're going to do that, then we shouldn't budget on anything. We have no idea what our sales tax is going to be. We don't have that money in the bank. But we can make educated guesses based on history of what it's going to be. There was a commitment from every single council member. I know there's new people up there, so you're not held responsible. You didn't make those commitments. That was going to happen. So the budget that we approved, which was balanced, was a responsible budget based on all the factors that you guys knew at the time. So don't let people beat you up about being irresponsible in your budgeting. I think we did the best we could with the information we had at the time. again, I think if you close the golf course down for what is theoretically a 2-year problem, cash flow problem, what's the long-term effects on that? What's the long-term effects of cutting any of these programs for next 2 years? So I think we need to look at some short-term gap problems. I don't think selling assets to cover an 18-month problem is the answer, because you won't get them sold in 18 months. And if you're going to sell your assets, they ought to be used for one-time revenue, should be used for one-time expenses. I think the city manager was asked that question and kind of mentioned the same thing. Anthony has said the same thing. There are times when you have to use that. Now, hopefully, we will get the $2 million from the FTA, but we don't know. That's why it wasn't budgeted. We don't budget ACOG funding either. That's a different deal. We know we apply for in the capital fund, but you don't know what you're going to get. So that we didn't budget for. Sales tax, and I want to remind people that this year's budget was based on 2.5% sales tax growth, not the 4% everybody talks about. The out years have that 4% in there, but you don't approve a budget on the out years. So those are nice indicators of where we're going, but they're not approved budgets. You haven't approved a $30 million shortfall 5 years from now or 3 years from now. In fact, I went back and looked at the 2013 budget. What do you think you predicted the fund balance is going to be this year? 8.1. Ended at 8.2. Then we took $4 million out. So that was pretty good. Hopefully you're not right on the rest of the budget going forward. But again, we use 2.5% sales tax growth. And as Mr. Francisco pointed out, we're pretty much on pace with that. You know, several years ago, we didn't budget anything for use tax. Well, court case comes down, says we're going to start collecting it. Now we're starting to collect use tax on online sales. We didn't budget that before we got it. But once we got it, we started budgeting for it. So I think you're doing a prudent job of budgeting with the best information you have available to you. But one of my points here is I want to be careful to not realize this is not a, you need to come up with $3.5 million for the next budgets for the next 5 years. You need to come up with this year's money, and you need to come up with 6 to 8 months of next year's. This is a short-term problem. Your long-term fixes are a much different discussion. Those are looking at your capital fund allocation. Those are stormwater deals. Those are maybe connection fees. You know, those are discussions you have. You're looking at all your fees. So I think you're doing a prudent job on this stuff. You just have tough decisions to make. And I want to keep in mind that when you pass that budget, you passed a balanced budget. There were already quite a bit of cuts that got to this point. So don't think you haven't already made cuts. And those all hurt, and those are all necessary. I was part of those deals. None of them were good. But we are nowhere close to being overstaffed. If you look at our number of employees per thousand, compare them to cities going around here, you've all seen numbers. We are a very lean and mean organization right now. But the city runs on personnel. If you have to start cutting police and fire, first of all, you got some union issues there, whether you can do that. And you've got public safety issues there. They're huge. Obviously, those are your last resorts, and I think the directive that you guys gave to Mr. Francisco was keep those things off the table was prudent. That has to be your last resort. But if you're going to come up with another $1.5 million, after you make those cuts, you've got no choice but to go into payroll. It's 60%, 65%? 60% of your budget is payroll. And after you cut all of this stuff out of there, and I know none of you guys want to do that. So let's not panic and make some long-term decisions. Because if you lay people off or you furlough them, they don't sit around waiting until the 2022 budget year to come back when you got money. They go elsewhere. They're not available. And you know, hiring new people, the training cost goes in there, is expensive. So, oh, the other thing we talked about a little bit about the PSST. It's a separate fund. And Mr. Francisco, is the PSST excess revenue? It's losing money, right? Okay. So the PSST is not a way to solve your current problems here. It is part of the problem. So changing that and tinkering with that isn't going to help you. It has more expense than it has revenue. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I swore I wasn't coming up here again, but everybody keeps responding to my issues, so I have to do that. Paul Arcaroli, 405 Garland Court. Just to clarify what Mr. Castleberry said and the issues that he brought up, I wanted to clarify.
I think I'm hearing some concerns from council members that this isn't necessarily a debate.
Yeah, no. I wanted to add more information. I'm not debating. The comment was allocation of funds. I suggested that the hotel tax, none of it's being allocated to the general fund. That was the point I was trying to make. That was not about raising the tax. It's allocation, reallocation, and changing it. And the other part about the golf course. Don't have to close it down, maybe make it smaller. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Camilla Jelly Stewart, 621 East Stewart Street. I have a question more than a comment, but going back to the primary reason for this shortfall in our budget being the tax increment and its ending, is it possible for possibly Catherine to review where we are with the timeline on the things that are beyond our control, just because I think that's really important in the budget discussion to know how long that money may be tied up or what that might look like. Thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. The petition was filed in early December, I believe, shortly after council adopted an ordinance amending the project plan for UNP. It was turned in within the 30-day timeline with sufficient number of signatures, and so it was a go, but it was challenged, and so the status of the challenge is it has been set for a court hearing on February 24th. Not sure if the judge will rule that day or will take it under advisement, or how long that will take, but that is the latest date at least. Once the judge enters his final order, the parties typically have 30 days to file a journal entry documenting that order, and then 30 days to appeal. And so once he issues the order, we're probably 60 days out, potentially 60 days out from knowing whether or not we have a firm answer or not.
Thank you.
Me again, Cynthia Rogers. Follow-up question. If the challengers withdrew their challenge, could there be an election in April and then an earlier, I suppose passed or didn't pass, an earlier progress towards addressing the budget gap?
The Local Development Act states that upon a filing of a successful referendum petition, it shall be set for the next general municipal election. A general municipal election is an election where all of the citizens in the city, all the registered voters can vote, and it's a regularly set election. So that would be the next mayoral election in 2022. If the challengers withdrew their petition, it could move forward to that date, certainly. We are certainly too late, despite what the statute says. If for some reason we move forward with the April date, I think we're probably too late to give the election board notice, or we're getting close to that date.
Thank you.
How great would it be if the University of Oklahoma had a permanent representative that you all could discuss and correspond with, and that they would be represented here so we could answers.
Thank you. Any other comment? Seeing none, it looks like we have a few council member comments. Councilmember Holman.
Anthony, I think it might be for you or Judd, but how many people work at Westwood Golf Course? So, whatever the number is, I think we've mentioned 9. Anthony, if you found it.
To the best of my knowledge, looking here, there are 2 full-time and 1 part-time position in the golf course budget, and then there are some others in Westwood Park maintenance that I'm sure are assigned to the golf course.
And all of those employees are City of Norman employees?
Yes.
Okay. So it'd be safe to say that you didn't include Westwood Golf Course in this list because this council instructed you not to cut jobs?
Yes, that's correct.
Several of us are on record actually telling employees they have nothing to worry about. Maybe you don't have anything to worry about if we deem that your job is worthy enough, should have been more appropriate. Maybe the employees at Westwood, maybe those jobs aren't worth saving to some. But I think that's why it's not included on this list, is because people work there, and we said we wanted a budget that didn't include cutting jobs. There are jobs at Westwood Golf Course. I think everything's got to be on the table when we're in a budget crisis, but that is why Westwood Golf Course isn't included on this list. Would you say that OU students pay sales tax in the city of Norman? And what is the funding source of the fire department in Norman? Sales tax. So do we charge any other group of residents in this city a separate fee for using the fire department or police department? Walmart, I know, has the most calls for service from the police department of any entity, business, residents in the entire city, and it's significantly more than any other business in Norman. Do we charge Walmart a fee for the amount of police calls that we have to respond to there? That could be something we consider. I know other cities have considered it when they've had a high number of volume calls to places like Walmart Supercenters, for example. But that is the kind of thing that comes to my mind when we hear suggestions about maybe we should charge OU for fire service. Well, the students at OU are paying sales tax into the city, which is what pays for fire service right now. How much does this University of Oklahoma reimburse the city for OU events? Do we know that? I think last I heard it was around $200,000 a game, but yeah. So the University of Oklahoma is currently and has been for a number of years paying the city of Norman for the use of our police service on game days. But we might want to do some more study into exactly what that cost really is, and if what we're getting reimbursed from OU is adequate to cover it. I know they have their own police department. I know there's police departments that are not just Norman, but Moore, and even Lawton police come down for that game day. So I'm not sure how all the details, but I would think that's something we should look at as well, as what is the true cost of that. And I had thought of connection fees too when I saw that, but as I know, and as mentioned by former Councilmember Castleberry, the connection fees go into the water fund. And the water fund doesn't have a budget crisis right now. I don't know that we're able to just take money out of the water fund and reallocate it to the general fund to fix a budget hole. I think I'll probably have some more questions, but I'll pass it on to my colleagues. Thank you.
Member.
Anthony, can you tell me exactly what makes a special revenue fund a special revenue fund?
Special revenue funds are allowed under the State Budget Act for areas where there are either contractual obligations or ordinances that have a separate revenue source that can only be used for that particular service. So in those areas, we try to, where there are major areas that have strings attached to them, such as the room tax, account for them separately in special revenue funds.
How did Westwood become a special revenue fund?
Westwood became a special revenue, Westwood historically had been an enterprise fund, where, and in the case of enterprise funds, the cost of providing the services theoretically at least attempted to be recovered from the users of the service. Westwood was changed from an enterprise fund to a special revenue fund, I'm going to say about 10 years ago, when the general fund started to subsidize the golf course operation.
Because to me, that's the point that I care about. Not whether or not Westwood continues to exist. To me, that's neither here nor there, but the fact that the general fund is subsidizing it this year to the tune of about $585,000, and that only continues to increase in future years. So what other options would a special revenue fund or a program or a place like Westwood have to bridge their own budget shortfall if they didn't have access to general fund monies? How would the water fund, as an example, as an enterprise fund, if they were facing a budget issue, try and bridge that gap?
Well, in the case of the water fund, obviously you would increase water rates, but in Norman, of course, that requires a vote of the people. If the people approve a water rate increase, then the water rate increase theoretically is set to recover the full cost of providing whatever water services. In the case of a service like the golf course, though, where you're charging a fee for the use of the golf course, you have to consider the competition from neighboring golf courses, and that's where I would think there's certainly a limit to the amount that you can charge for the golf services when you have such a fierce competition in the regional area for golf customers.
Because to me, that number is the most concerning part, not whether or not Westwood continues to exist. We also have a golf superintendent who's leaving in March, so this is not an awful time to start thinking about what we want to do with Westwood. It's actually on our positions report, so if anyone wants to look at that, they can find that there. So my next question is, I want to go back. I actually went, and now I lost it in the book because I was looking up golf. I am curious about the significant increase in cost to the rec centers. I wasn't sure what, and then I looked on page 211 in our book, and yeah, we go from like $4,000 to $174,000 in a span of 2 years for these rec centers. And
Yeah,
so is this
I
moving
would
forward
defer to
related?
the Parks Director, but I think it has something to do with changing how those rec centers were accounted for. Whether there used to be a recreation cost center, and they split them out into separate cost centers for the various rec centers.
Okay.
And that may account for some of it.
Okay, because that was a little surprising to me. I mean, Whittier Rec Center went from $3,300 in FY18 to $127,000 for the revised estimate for FY19. So that was a surprising jump, and I couldn't pull out
I
of
know
my
that
brain
there was
anything
no
having
big
to do with
explosion in the
Norman
service at
Forward
Whittier
or-
Rec Center. I think it has something to do with how the supervision was accounted for, and perhaps the supervisor had been accounted for in a centralized recreation budget that was split out into the various centers.
Okay. And then for our unfilled positions, this positions vacancy report, we have 17 positions currently on hold. Are these positions that are currently funded in this year's budget?
Yes.
Do you know the total for those 17 positions?
I do not, but I will say, and this was a question that came up from one of the comments. In the case where budgeted positions are held vacant, that does not impact on the budget, but it does impact on the fund balance, where you have some savings, where you had budgeted positions, you didn't have to pay out those salaries, then there are some savings. But recall that council budgets for some of those savings in the employee turnover savings assumption in each year in the general fund.
Right. Well, I would like to get a little bit more information about the impact that would have. I know the difference between, it's almost like the difference between theoretical dollars and real dollars in hand when you're talking budgets versus what we're actually spending. But to me, this would be one place to look as well. I know we already talked about things like not filling the sustainability coordinator position, which has not been filled yet. So I would much rather not fill a position than take away someone's job. So I think that's something that I would like to press on a little bit and know a little bit more about, because this is the second time since I've been on council that cutting social and voluntary services has come up. Second time in 3 years that it's come up, and it's always that kind of low-hanging fruit. And I really just want to look more deeply at it, because we had people tonight speak really eloquently about the impact that those programs have. And I'm not willing to do the easy things without also doing the hard things that might cause some heartburn. I know that the thought of anything happening in golf causes a lot of heartburn, but the fact that social and voluntary services remains on this list and not other things, that gives me some concern. And then I have a process question maybe for the city manager. When are we looking at in terms of a decision on this? On what's our last possible day to make this decision? Because there was some really good feedback tonight, and I would like to make sure that we follow through on getting some information on some of these things before we make a decision.
I would only say the sooner the better, because the longer we go apportioning sales tax and taking away revenue that we budgeted for, the harder it will be to make up for those lost revenues.
Yep.
So don't have a date picked out. We wanted to obviously see what surfaced from this evening's conversation. Back to you as quickly as we can start crunching some additional numbers. Did make note specifically to take a peek at where we are budget to actual in all of our general fund departments, just to see how close we are holding to the assumptions made about the annual turnover and vacancy rates that we account for. I think the number in there was a little over 800,000. So we want to see how far in excess of that 800,000 we've achieved, and that would be something that would chip away at the number before us tonight.
I appreciate that, and I would also like to know kind of the difference between our annual audit and what, I don't know what you call it, a dollars and cents audit or I doubt forensic audit is the right word, but I mean things like being able to find the money for the warming shelter from the Crossroads Youth Center account. Those are the kinds of things that just, I don't know how long that takes, but I feel like we don't think about those things when everything is running smooth. And so I don't know when the last time it was that we had a full-on kind of dollars and cents accounting of Crossroads is no longer in existence. So this fund that has money in it no longer needs to be here, or a better explanation to us as to why something like that can happen. And lastly, about Embark, I'm done with fare back boxes. I'm done with doing anything more than the absolute bare minimum because of all of this. I cannot justify cutting social and voluntary services and then spend $200,000 to $300,000 painting buses and putting in fare boxes that are not likely to recoup the amount of money that we're going to be spending on them. So as much of that $1 million in startup costs as we can put back and say this is a nice to have and not a need to have, I would like to do. We've got 2 nicely painted white buses. If those are not on our most heavily traveled routes, I assume that they will be going there, and decals for those don't cost a whole lot. So if Oklahoma City can get 5 years to put all of the Embark graphics on their buses, we can take our sweet time too, because we actually have more pressing issues that we need to take care of right now. So that's where I'm at.
Just a quick point of clarification, Mr. Francisco, the transit fund is currently operating in a separate fund, and the cost, what we're talking about is the ability to avoid additional contributions to the transit fund from the general fund. So as we stand today, if we paint the buses, will that require an additional general fund contribution?
My understanding just from the Public Works Director's presentation earlier, or last week, was that the painting of the buses was part of the transitional cost that had been budgeted for. And it's just a question of how much to spend and on what. But you know, yes, you could save those costs and just not do it. Or only put decals on the buses that are plain white now. Those are certainly decisions that could be made.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Scott.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for coming. Thank you for explaining and participating in this tonight. I have a couple questions, and then I actually have to leave early. I have a prior obligation. So, Anthony, again, are we not mandated by the state to pass a balanced budget?
Yes, pursuant to the Oklahoma Municipal Budget Act, the council cannot adopt a budget when there is not a positive projected fund balance in each fund that you're adopting the budget for.
Thank you. And so, as was mentioned earlier, we unanimously passed a balanced budget, assuming that we were going to end the TIF increment at the university. I'm sorry, because I heard you.
In that case,
yesterday.
TIF is
Hey,
accurate.
I know. I'm sorry. Ending the increment, we assumed that we voted unanimously, and we're all on board to do that. And so now that this petition situation is happening and we are facing an unbalanced budget and for this fiscal year, what is the recourse for the state to take against us as a city? Is there a penalty?
Well, the Budget Act relates to the budget, and adopting a budget when you have a projected negative fund balance in a fund. In this case, we're talking about a situation where we're drawing down the fund balance in an existing budget year to a dangerously low level, and what do we want to do about that? And we know that if we continue on the course that we are on, we would be in the situation in the budget that we're going to be talking about in the next 2 to 3 months, that we cannot adopt a legal budget, which is greatly contributed to by this situation related to TIF.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a couple of comments regarding the census, a couple of these items. So the census contract, we want to participate in the census because the census determines funding, correct?
Yes, ma'am. And again, when this list was put together, just understand that it was not put together without an appreciation for the fact that these are difficult things, that there's downsides to all of this.
I understand.
Council just approved that contract for the census consultant, but it was an area of potential savings because they had not started work yet. And yes, there would be a downside to it.
But we already approved our contract, and so we can just not go through with our contract? Is that
Yeah,
what
just, they have to have a start work order, basically.
Thank you.
It hasn't been given.
Okay. I don't like the idea of cutting any of these things, obviously. So I do love the idea of raising revenue, and I always say I've had very unique ideas that people don't like to listen to on the dais here. But as far as traffic signals, supplies, we already have trash traffic in the city of Norman. I don't think that's a great idea. It's a public safety issue. I think actually many of these are public safety issues. When it comes to a reduction of prisoner care, we have one of the highest rates of hepatitis C among our prison population in the nation, and that's public safety to me, and that's putting lives at risk when we're cutting things like that. When we're cutting prison care and taking care of people, that's putting lives at risk. All of these decisions affect lives. And then I have a question about police overtime. So we're already subsidizing the public safety sales tax out of the general fund, correct? Is there a way that we can mandate zero overtime, like a zero overtime policy for the time being? And I
Um,
understand also that the voters voted in favor of the public safety sales tax twice. And we have an obligation to the voters. However, considering the situation, is it possible to follow through with a policy of that nature?
Chief Foster is actively reviewing the current overtime situation and the activities that result in overtime, often generated by court callbacks to officers who don't necessarily fall on shift when they're due to appear in court. That automatically triggers callback and overtime that goes along with it, along with our detectives that respond to active crime scenes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But the chief is intimately aware of the current budget situation and the volume of overtime dollars.
But is there a way that we can mandate a policy that says 0 overtime?
I think if there are exceptions recognized, and I don't know what the MOUs say with our bargaining unit on the police side, I think we would see some interesting shift staggering to say that, it's 40 hours a week. When you hit 40, you're out. If that means a patrol car sits parked.
Yep.
Patrol car sits parked. I would say it's absolutely something to be negotiated, and I'll look at my city attorney and see if that's an MOU negotiable issue, or if that's management's prerogative to say we're going to have a policy that says 0 overtime.
I'd have to look at the contract. I know we do negotiate the shifts and the way that has worked, and so I suspect that plays into the union contract
Okay.
to some degree.
I appreciate that, and it's just something that I'm curious about since this is what we're discussing, and I don't like the idea of cutting anything to the Women's Resource Center or things that help children or fight hunger and like help homeless people, especially being with Sutton Wilderness in Ward 8. Homelessness is a huge issue, and we don't want to cut anything that helps eradicate homelessness in our city. So a question about the stormwater utility, how much of our general fund is allocated? About $3 million. And we can't get the voters to vote for a stormwater utility. And I'm just so Carrie and Sean know, I'm not coming for them or anything, but the thing is that this is a public safety issue. We could cut all of our stormwater funding, and we wouldn't be looking at any of these, and we would still have to come up with $500,000, correct? So those are the hard decisions that we're facing, but I think that's something that we should. We're looking at all of these, right? Let's look at those too. And I understand that may mean jobs as well, because that's something that goes too. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Wilson.
Thank you. As someone who has landed an airplane at Westheimer, I know that there is a runway protection zone that is 1,000 feet from the end of the runway. So just for y'all's information. I think that's covered by the property that's already owned by the airport, and so Westwood should be.
It's different than the clear zone.
Is different than the clear zone, but that's a height restriction. You can build, but you can't build to a certain height. Anyways, so but to get around that, how about a free Frisbee golf course? Just saying. I think that I don't know the solutions today. I do not support having a golf course over a women's resource center or Bethesda or any of that stuff. So I think that if we have to just close it for a season or something to that effect, that would be a place that could be cut. But I think the bigger topic here, and I agree with former council member Castleberry, that we have a temporary problem to solve. And but the bigger problem is not going away, which is our revenue problem. And I love that we had this opportunity to hear from the public and hear what's important to you guys. And I love that the social services people showed up and care about what they're doing. But things like cutting that 1% capital to a 0.5% is, I think, a great plan for future problems. As a I think, the only state in the nation that the municipalities depend on sales tax in a state of flux that we're in as a world, where we're ordering fake trees from China. I know somebody did that recently. That, you know, we're ordering stuff online, we're buying online, we don't have to manufacture it locally, we don't have to, you know, the consumer dollar is different now than it used to be. So we need to prepare for that in our future. And I know that as a city, we are looking at all of our fees. I think it's important that we charge sustainable fees. And if some of them are too high because we're trying to make up for other ones that are too low, then that's something we need to address, and I think it's being addressed. And the Ralph Dallas study is one of those things that I appreciate for that. The current, I do not support cutting jobs over having a golf course. I do not support cutting social services over having a golf course. I had actually suggested privatization, in that we still have a golf course, but we have an entity come run it for us that can do it at a, you know, like a business, but I don't know that that's feasible either. And we only have a few months to get this done, so that won't happen in a few months. However, it looks like we're probably got a guy leaving, so he's choosing to not have that job anymore, so that's a good thing. And then we can choose not to hire the seasonal workers, because I don't know how many people play golf this time of year. I don't play golf, so I don't know. But, so there's that. I think that, you know, if the fees have to go up at the golf course, then that's part of the problem. That's, you know, we need to do it. I would be more interested in finding out when the hospital dollars are coming in. That actually weighed in on my decision to approve a bond of $120 million being spent in our community, because that actually helped free up some of our dollars if we were to sell that property. So I guess that's my input. I also would like to understand more about audits and forensic audits. Maybe that's an offline conversation, because it's just my education of me. And let's see, I have questions all over this thing, but some of them were answered already. I'm about to run out of voice, so hold on. Okay, I'll just let it go from there, but that's my input. No cutting of jobs, make magic money happen, get rid of the golf course because I don't care about it. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. I care about it. The end.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Patron?
So this has been really interesting for me to hear all these different comments. And I guess I want to follow up in somewhat of a orderly fashion, I hope. On the golf course, Mr. Castleberry spoke to being a member of another public course at OU. And I wonder if we've taken a look at comparing the our public course versus that public course in fees, and what, if we're putting one another, are we competing, in other words, the city versus the state, or two different public courses in the same city? And if we're not competing, maybe we should be, if we're going to keep them open. So I would be interested in having I don't play golf, much like I don't swim. I would be interested in looking at that closer to see how much it costs for a round of golf at OU versus how much it costs for a round of golf in Norman, and see if it's even possible for us to come closer to recouping our fees at the golf course, or coming closer anyway. And then he also spoke to being a member, and I wondered if there's a possibility of a public course here to be a member of this public course. These are both public courses, so well, it's owned by the state of Oklahoma, correct? It's an agency of the state of Oklahoma? So they've gone, okay, semi-private. Well, there's another, so if there's another level, not public, not private, but semi-private. So, yes, I will call you because I am not a golfer, and I would be interested to hear what opportunities we might be leaving on the table there. But I also agree with Kate when she talks about how do we justify cutting off Bethesda for, kids needing therapy for heinous abuse, but keeping so that we can subsidize whatever. I don't know. So I think these are all difficult conversations, but at the same time, I think that there's the talent up here and the compassion that we can make sense of that. So we can figure out what those difficult decisions are and continue soliciting input from people who play these sports. I agree that we do have a revenue problem. So Mr. Francisco brought up changing the capital fund allocation on the sales tax, and so did Mr. Castleberry, and I think that we need to look at moving forward with that, and I would wonder on that, we've talked about doing revenue bonds or go bonds for those capital projects, and I wondered, I'll be asking a question about that down the line here in a minute, but how many of us have to, in public comment, say, yeah, I'm interested in doing that to get it set for a study session on moving forward? But mark me down as one that's interested there. And I also agree that we need to take a look at changing the hotel motel allocation. And I was just perusing those ordinances, and I asked Mr. Francisco, in fact, at the last meeting about this. That's a $2 million budget a year, and we haven't changed. We still need to be complying with the ordinance, but council has the discretion to be able to change how much revenue goes here and there, and so I think that that's a big budget, and most of it's not staying within the city of Norman, so, well, as far as the entity. So I would be interested definitely in moving forward with that, and maybe we can get half of that back into paying some of our own bills. So that would be about $1 million that we could bring back. Looking back through the records, at one point, Mr. Hickman, let's see, on April the 23rd of 19, he suggested going back to the voters to right side PSST because the general fund is, under an increasing burden of trying to live up to the expectations of what was sold to the voters, much like Norman Forward, and that's going to be another one that we're going to have to tackle as well. So that was kind of where I was going to ask Mr. Francisco. Well, for one, I am interested in potentially investigating that as to whether or not they're going back to the voters and letting them know that this was, underfunded. What can we do about that? But also, would there be go bond or revenue bond eligibilities there for some of those projects rather than continuing to do pay-go out of the general fund?
As it relates to the public safety sales tax funded critical capital needs, as they were called, yes, there could be a voter referendum to pay for those out of general obligation bonds instead of the public safety sales tax. It would have to be referred to the voters, but yes, that would be a possibility. Your other question related to revenue bonds, however, just, conceptually, a revenue bond has to have a revenue source to pay for it. And where we are demonstrating revenue shortfalls, it would be very difficult to make a case that from this revenue source, public safety sales tax or general fund sales tax, we can take on additional projects and pay for them with revenue bond because, we're already demonstrating some stress in paying for the bills that we have already.
Okay, and then what about, so the go bond, we would need to go back to the voters. How would this be any different than saying when we change the capital fund allocation?
It wouldn't be very different at all. You'd have to go back to the voters. In the case of the public safety sales tax, I suspect you'd be asking for a rate increase. In the case of the capital sales tax, you'd be asking for a redistribution of that 0.7%. But just remember that if you reduce the 0.7%, then you have that much less to do those critical capital things that you're paying for out of the capital fund now.
Okay, let me ask it differently maybe. And maybe I can have this same conversation with Mr. Castleberry at lunch one time, but I don't know all of the different projects that are delineated in public safety sales tax question that was sent twice to the voters. So my question is that of those projects, which ones could we reasonably defend as capital projects such that we would
The major ones of the critical capital needs that were approved by the voters have either been completed or are very close to, the radio system was the largest of those critical capital needs. The Emergency Operations Center building that is council has approved design contracts, foreign land purchases and plats and all of that are ongoing, is a major one of those critical capital needs that we assume will be done over the next year. So again, yes, theoretically, you could go back to the voters and say, instead of paying for that with the public safety sales tax, would you pay for that with the general obligation bond? You could. The one that is outstanding, that has not even started design or anything yet, is the reconstruction of Fire Station 5.
Okay.
And so, yes, that could be referred back to the voters.
And do you know how much we believed at the time that would be? You can ballpark it out. I'm just curious.
I want to say 3.5 million, but I'm trying to find the exact number. Yes, I was right, 3.5 million.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's it for the moment. Oh, it's not. Sorry. What are the individually assigned vehicles? How many of them? Who has them? What is that exactly?
Basically, the majority of police officers have a car that is assigned to them that they take home. The Public Works Director over the years has pointed out that if we had fewer individually assigned vehicles, basically because there are 3 shifts of police officers, you would have one car that's assigned, and you check out a car when you come onto your shift. And so you would certainly have some savings in fuel costs. There would be some increased costs because of increased wear and tear on the vehicle, so replacement costs would probably go up over time. But there'd be probably some decreases in fuel costs and just usage of the vehicles.
What is the typical life on, how many years does a police car typically
About
get?
6 years, I believe.
If you hot swap those vehicles and they stay on the road virtually 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they last about 3 years.
Okay. And how many did you say that there were?
About 120, I believe.
Okay. Currently, do they drive them home or they stay here at
Yes,
the lot?
no, they drive them. Those are the ones that are driven home.
Okay. And the Public Works Director, you said, has suggested this as a potential cost savings in the past?
Yes.
So while it says cut individually assigned vehicles, is this, maybe it's something that it's been suggested already?
Yeah, and that's why there's a to be determined figure on there, because this would be a next year program at the earliest, and there'd have to be some exploration of how many you could save and how much you would budget for a cost savings in those fuel costs.
Okay, well, I guess if this is something that police department thinks is a good idea and Public Works thinks is a good, everybody thinks that, I don't have an opinion one way or the other, so I'm trying to understand.
I would say that there's a disagreement between the Public Works Department and the Police Department about.
Ooh, internal politics, huh? Okay, well, maybe that would explain why it hasn't been put into, the trigger hasn't been pulled there. I guess, I think if it's on your list and it's been, I would like to hear from both departments as to why, especially from the police department. sounds like the cost savings is why Public Works feels that way, and I wondered what the dollars and cents actually are for that. And so that to be decided is something that are decided. And then also from the police chief as to, what he thinks about it as well. I agree with Kate that the buses getting new paint jobs right away is definitely not in the same realm as some of these others. The buses might not be beautiful right now, but they are running, and that is an exciting thing. And we will be getting some transportation sales tax money come June 1st, at which point we can then talk about getting the paint jobs that we want on there, because right now the city's investigating having its own exciting way of decorating these buses, and maybe some advertisements if that's something that the city thinks is a good idea. I think that's a discussion that needs to be had, but for now that would be $700,000 back into the budget, and another $300,000 for the fare boxes that we're not using back into the budget. So that $1 million, it sounds to me like council needs to take another look at maybe paying our bills with that. And then in June, talk about making our buses pretty. I do wonder about I'm not sure that the right word is forensic, but the forensic audit. I don't think that that's a bad idea for transparency purposes alone. I think that the city, our residents would like to know how many dollars this city has and where they're all going, and what has council allocated that it hasn't maybe spent, or that it has spent. Where's it going? I think that people probably deserve to see that if it doesn't cost too much to do one of those. So I would be interested to know what one of those would cost. And then someone else asked for an update on the Norman Regional Hospital land sale, and I think Sarita did as well. And maybe I was taking notes. I know that the hospital board let the money and approved the sale. Do we know when we're gonna have the answer to whether Mr. Split is gonna decide that he wants to do that?
We're hoping early in February to have that whole question asked and answered. And the city attorney would be drafting a purchase and sales agreement for council to consider. So hopefully mid-February, the question will be before you to enter into purchase and sale of that property.
Okay. I think that's all I have for right now. Again, I just really appreciate every input, and hey, you'll be up here soon. These are your problems.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Holman.
So speaking of transit, we did talk about transit the other day, Thursday, and we got some news about funding for transit. So the sales tax that voters approved covers the operations of the existing system. It doesn't cover the capital costs of constructing a new bus maintenance facility or a bus transit hub, since we're not going to be able to use the one at OU anymore either. And so, Anthony, if you might speak to the amount of dollars that we are seeking this year to build a maintenance facility for the new bus system. It's not, these funds are not covered by the sales tax that we just
Yes, sir. The amount of funds that we have been discussing to seek is related to the amount of funds that OU paid back to the Federal Transit Administration, and that was about $3 million.
And the cost of constructing the maintenance facility,
The most recent estimate that I've heard is about $6 million.
which we don't have any of right now. We have
No, sir.
0 of that $6 million.
No, sir.
And when is the deadline for the maintenance facility that we're currently using? For
I
us?
believe that the council extended the contract, and the OU Regents approved an extension of that contract until June the 30th.
Of this year.
Yes, sir.
So we have until June 30th to come up with $6 million additional dollars and construct a maintenance facility. Maybe OU will let us go on for a little bit longer. But this is already an extension. We've already been extended. So we'd be asking them for another extension, from what I understand. So in addition to the budget shortfall, we also need to find $6 million for the bus system this year. And these cuts, which I would not support this list of cuts. I mean, some of them I could live with, but several of them I couldn't. So even then, we're not getting to the 2.1 million that's listed here in my view. And we have to fill the budget shortfall, and then we need to find more money for transit. We might be able to get some from the federal government, but I would guess that that process isn't going to happen in the next few months. That federal government's not all of a sudden going to say in the next few months, oh yeah, you did give us that money, we'll give it back to you. So I'm not necessarily anticipating that those are going to come in by the end of this budget year. Hopefully it will. Maybe I'll be wrong and we'll get a surprise. So this also brings the question to, we now do not have any funding to purchase land for the indoor aquatic center or the multi-sport gymnasium. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Because those projects didn't have a budget for land purchase, did they?
No, sir.
What funding source were we going to use to buy land for those projects?
Well, that was part of the project plan amendments that council approved in November.
We were going to use TIF funds to purchase land for Norman Forward projects.
Yes, sir.
Okay, but since that's on hold, we don't have those funds now. So we don't have any land to build these projects on now, and we don't have any money to buy land for them, even if we could find it, from what I understand. Okay, and how much money do we need for the senior center to do it the way that everybody wants it done?
Yeah, the figure keeps changing. Yeah, 13 million is.
So by my count, we're over $20 million here. So the hospital sale, if I recall, our guess was $5.8 million we might get back, or might get out of that sale, maybe.
5.08.
5.08.
Okay, so. Yeah. So we have a budget shortfall. We need $6 million for transit. We need money for land purchases for at least two Norman Forward projects. I'm not entirely clear how the process will work if we want to locate the senior center at the Norman Regional Hospital Porter campus. If that would be a land lease thing, like $1 a year thing, if Norman Regional would let us do that, or if we would have to buy back land from them at some point in 3 years when they tear down the hospital. I know for sure that if we do it over there, the senior center won't happen for another 2 to 3 years at earliest, because we have to wait for that property to be available for a building, I guess. So
I don't know. I would think it would be an option to build in current parking lot land but
So I guess my main point is I'm seeing budget issues that go far beyond these cuts and go far beyond hoping that the hospital land sale will fix our problem.
Yes, sir.
Is what I'm looking at. These are why I made the decisions that I've made sitting up here. I knew exactly what I was voting for in November. I was looking ahead, pretty far ahead. I knew exactly what I was voting for, and it was to avoid this situation.
Thank you, Councilmember. We are quickly running out of time, and I have done my best to let my colleagues speak, and so I will quickly say one thing. I just returned from the Mayor's Innovation Project and Women Mayors Network event in DC, which the city did not pay for. Just want to clarify that. And we had a whole session on emphasizing the importance of the census. That is a short-sighted move to cut the money to support that, because we're talking hundreds, possibly thousands of dollars per person per year. And you know what people don't get counted that this money will help get counted? Lower socioeconomic, immigrant, and children. So I will not support the $112,000 because that will hurt Norman for the next decade. So that is my comments on that. Councilmember Bierman, if you can keep it real short because they're ready to go.
So the one thing I wanted to add is that I think what all of this discussion and even a number of the things that Councilmember Holman mentioned to me is exactly why at the March Oversight Committee we're going to be talking about boards and commissions, and one of the things we're going to be talking about is a citizen budget committee. And that is because we have a lot of problems that we're facing. We're also facing a lot of budget creep, and projects that have now gotten blown way above and beyond the budgets that were pitched to voters or approved by voters, or, I mean, even things like the municipal complex renovation, which is something that was only barely touched on. There's not a one single reason for all of these things happening. However, getting citizens involved in this process, not just during mid-year adjustment, not just during the finance committee meetings that lead up to the passing of a budget, but all year, every single year, is something we're going to be talking about in March and hopefully can implement by the time our next budget is passed. So if you have any thoughts about that, please let me know. I'm going to be compiling as many of my notes as I can and trying to get some info from staff, and then hopefully we'll be back here with some short-term solutions for our short-term problems so we can start working on the long-term solutions for our long-term problems.
Thank you, council members. Thank you all for coming tonight. I encourage you again to stick around. League of Women Voters will be moving in shortly for the candidate forum. Have a nice night.